Sandra Fritz, I'm the chairperson of the Shrewsbury School Committee, and welcome to our meeting of July 8th. Tonight's virtual meeting is being broadcast live on Celco channels 29 and 329 and streamed live on the Shrewsbury Media Connections website. Thank you to SMC Executive Director Mark Serra and Shrewsbury Public Schools IT Director Brian LaRue, who help us each week with these meetings. Tonight's meeting will be rebroadcast between now and our next regularly scheduled meeting on July 15th. Before we begin tonight's meeting, I would like to inform and share with the community that Lori Sear, who was a special education administrative assistant in the district, recently passed away after a very short battle with cancer. Notification to the high school staff from Principal Todd Bazidlo stated that Lori was an integral part of the SHS family and worked tirelessly to ensure our special education department operated properly and efficiently. Lori provided unwavering support and encouragement to those with whom she interacted. This was especially true for the members of the special education department, from our paraprofessionals, teachers, students, parents, and former director Kathy LaRoche and current director Meg DeLeon. They all adored and depended on Lori. In my observations and interactions with Lori, there was no challenge too great or issue too small that she would not take on. She always worked her hardest to accomplish a goal or complete a task and always did this with a smile on her face. Her work ethic and positive outlook on life should serve as a model for every member of our school community. On behalf of the school committee, I would like to offer Lori's family condolences on our part, and I would ask that we all participate in a moment of silence. Thank you. First on the agenda is public participation. Now that we're using a Zoom webinar platform, people are able to participate in this portion. So anybody in the community who would like to address the committee can do so by sending the school committee an email at schoolcommittee@shrewsbury.k12.ma.us. And this evening, Ms. Zaire has asked if she could address the committee, and I'd like to turn this over to Ms. Zaire.
Hi, I just want to make sure you can all hear me.
Yes, we can. Welcome.
Thank you. Okay, I'll just read my letter. Dear Dr. Sawyer and school committee members, I understand that the district is in a tough situation right now and making many cuts across the board. However, at the same time, both the recent equity audit and the Department of Education data shows large inequities in our ELL department. To highlight a few, number one, 53.5% of ELL students were chronically absent compared to the school average of 23.9%. Number two, 40% of ELL students participated in advanced courses as opposed to an overall school average of 92.4%. Number three, 47.1% of ELL students went on to attend an institute of higher education compared with an 85.4% average of the entire student population. As you continue to move money around in the budget, I would like to ask for your consideration in adding either a teacher's aide or a reading tutor to the high school ELL department, while the newly formed coalition comes up with a more thorough and longer-term plan to address these inequities. While I understand that the district is making incredibly difficult decisions and mostly discussing cuts, I also believe an investment needs to be made in resolving these issues, and hope this is something district leadership will consider as you move forward with your final decisions. Thank you in advance for your consideration.
Thank you, Ms. Zaire, for addressing the committee this evening, and we will definitely take that information under advisement. So okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next on the agenda is chairperson and members report. Does anybody have anything this evening? Jason.
Thank you, Mrs. Fritz and colleagues. Just something I'd like to bring to your attention that I intend to put before the committee at our next regularly scheduled meeting. Colleagues, as you may be aware, there has been a resolution making the rounds of school committees throughout the Commonwealth. I believe about 120 school committees across the state thus far have adopted, requesting that the state work to guarantee that every school district will receive full reimbursement for whatever COVID expenses are mandated by the state that are encumbered by local school districts. Obviously, I recognize that the Commonwealth's hands are also somewhat limited when it comes to raising revenues, but they're certainly far less restricted than our own. So I just wanted to give my colleagues a heads up that I do intend to bring this resolution before our committee at our next regularly scheduled meeting. And I will send it to the chair and the superintendent and Ms. McCollum and ask that it be placed in the book for next week.
Okay, thank you, Jason. And I think that's something important that we do add to our agenda next week for everybody to take a look at. Okay, next is superintendent's report.
Thank you, Ms. Fritz. Want to be sure, can people hear me on the call? Okay,
Yes.
thank you. I just want to thank Ms. Zaire for her comments, and that's something that we will certainly look into and consider, and appreciate the commentary on the English language learning program at Shrewsbury High School. Also, with regard to at the start of the meeting, as Ms. Fritz held a moment of silence for Lori Sear, our colleague who passed away recently. And I just want to add, on behalf of everyone in the school district, how heartbroken our colleagues are at Shrewsbury High School. Ms. Sear only worked at Shrewsbury High School for a few years, but she made a tremendous positive impact. The tributes that I've seen from those with whom she worked make it clear that she really was a remarkable person. We want to wish and give condolences to her family. She clearly made an incredible difference at Shrewsbury High School, and she'll be dearly missed. As far as an update for the committee and the community, we did begin remote programming for our summer extended year special education programming this week. The special education leadership, along with other leaders in the district, have also been working towards being able to bring a small number of, well, smaller number than usual, but looking at over 200 students who may have the ability to actually have some in-person services starting later in July. Those plans are being finalized in accordance with the various guidance we have from the state and public health officials, and we will be communicating that shortly to families who will be able to participate in some in-person work. We know that this work is also helping us with the planning we're doing for reopening schools in the fall. As those who have been watching our meetings know, we have to provide 3 plans to the state. One plan for potential in-person learning with a minimum of 3-foot social distancing based on the most recent guidelines from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. One for a hybrid approach that would include some in-person and some remote learning, likely on an alternating schedule if we need to have a lower number of students in the population at school in person, and also for a full remote program, depending on what's going to be required based on how the virus evolves. We have subcommittees that are beginning or continuing work rather on and really getting into the meat of trying to create some plans that will work. We're awaiting some key additional guidance from the state, particularly on transportation, which we'll hear from Mr. Collins later in the meeting about. And so the leadership team is working hard here during this period to try to look at all of our options and try to come up with the best plan we possibly can to provide the best education we can under the circumstances that we have to operate within. So we'll continue to update the committee and the community on those plans as they develop, and I appreciate all the work that everyone's doing to make that move forward. And that is Superintendent's report this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. First on the agenda this evening, Dr. Sawyer will provide an update on equity and anti-racism work in the district. And before he begins his report, I would like to let the community know that the school committee did receive a letter from Kathy B., along with who's an alumni of SHS, along with other students and alumni. Over 500 SHS alumni, current students, parents, staff, and community members signed this letter, and it was addressed to the Shrewsbury High School administration, but we did receive a copy of it along with school administration. And they are requesting that the district increase its efforts around equity and anti-racism. Tomorrow, Dr. Sawyer, myself, along with Principal Todd Bazzillo and the assistant principals at SHS are going to meet with Kathy along and hopefully with some other members who authored the letter to talk about it, to get some clarification from them and some guidance on what they're also looking for. And I really would like to thank them for the amount of effort and work that they put into this letter and their suggestions. It was very well done. And we do appreciate the fact that they're taking the time to share their opinions and want to work to make this a better school district and better community. So Dr. Sawyer, I'll turn this over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Fritz. I also wanted to thank, and I believe it was about 575 some odd people, mostly recent alumni of Shrewsbury High School, as well as some current students of Shrewsbury High, some current parents, as well as some current community members who were signatories to the document. I think that the letter contains many interesting ideas about how we might advance equity and anti-racist work at Shrewsbury High School. I am looking forward to meeting with the lead author, Kathy B., as you mentioned, Ms. Fritz, and others, I believe, are going to be joining that call who worked on this letter tomorrow, along with Chair Fritz, as well as Mr. Zidlow and some number of the assistant principals from the high school. I do think it is remarkable to have this many people communicating with us regarding a particular issue. I am proud that so many recent alumni care so deeply about their school community, and I'm certainly confident that the passion that they have about these issues will contribute to helping us make constructive change. I also want to mention to the community that we are still looking for individuals to become part of the coalition that we are beginning, the Coalition on Equity and Anti-Racism for our school district. If you are interested in participating or contributing in some way, I invite you to send an email to the email address equity@shrewsbury.k12.ma.us. We've had a number of people contact us already, and we're looking at how to do some initial structuring of the work of this coalition. I've been working and looking at what some other school districts have done who have addressed these kinds of things in past years, as well as who are doing some things currently, first to look for some good ideas in the field. I do want to let the committee and the community know that we've done some initial planning for some of our summer leadership work that our administrative team does each summer. Each year we have a couple of different internal leadership conferences to do planning for the coming year and to address issues of importance for the school district. This year will certainly be looking at equity and anti-racism as one of the key topics, along with, of course, the reopening of school, which is the biggest time-sensitive issue, of course, that we have to deal with. But we will be making that part of our agendas, and we have selected the book Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain by Zaretta Hammond. It's a highly recommended book that has been was published recently, and that has been highly recommended from a variety of experts around trying to find actionable ways for school districts to address the best ways to serve students from different cultures and races and ethnic backgrounds effectively in an education setting. Every year we do a book study through our leadership team, and that is the book we've selected for this year. So that's just one small initial step that we're taking. Amy Clouder, our Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum Instruction and Assessment, who's also in charge of professional development, has been working she's been engaging with a variety of potential professional development providers as we look to what would make sense to do on this topic, and something that we can do that would be as effective as possible as some initial steps. This is work that is going to take time. It has urgency, of course, but we also want to be thoughtful and make sure that we're being very planful so that we can make sure that the actions that we do take are as effective as they can possibly be. So that's a bit of an update. Again, I look forward to our meeting tomorrow with some of the authors of the letter. I appreciate everyone who signed their name to it, and it's an issue that we're very much looking forward to addressing in the coming weeks, months, and years.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. Any questions or comments from the committee? Lindsay? You're frozen. Did you unmute? I think Lindsay's frozen. Does anybody else have a question or a comment while we wait for Lindsay to come on?
You hear me, Sandy?
Oh, yeah, now we can. There
Sorry.
you go.
My mouse stopped working. I couldn't click anything. Apologies to all of you. I want to just sort of echo and support Dr. Sawyer's efforts to figure out not only how do we come up with a meaningful way to respond and have a multi-pronged strategy, because this is a very long game. I analogized this recently to somebody and they said it's a marathon. And I'm like, it's like a world Ironman, right? It is much longer than even that. And so thinking about sustainability, I think, is really important and worth the effort to get right, that we're not here to check a box as a community, and that we want to put something in place that can really build this. And so I would just double down on Dr. Sawyer's request to the community that we are looking for people to partner with us, that this is about schools, but also about community. And so as people are able and willing to really commit the time and energy to help us be planful in that we need that support too, from home and parents, but also our community partners. So I hope people will take us up on that and join us in this, this long. I don't think we have to ask people to make a many-year commitment, but we want them to commit to really stick with us and be part of the change and hold us accountable. So as we get the many letters that we get from the community, they're important for us to listen to. And I think we're trying to do our best to stay open and hear all of it, but also make a smart plan to move forward. So I want to just commend you, Dr. Sawyer, for trying to balance the urgency and the need to put structure so it's sustainable. So thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Any further comments or questions? Some screens are freezing, so if you want to speak up, that will work as well. I'm not seeing anyone. Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. And again, we look forward to this. Like Lindsay said, this is going to be a long process, but we need to do it right, and we need to be very mindful and thoughtful as we proceed through it. Okay, next on the agenda, we are going to have an update from Mr. Collins on the fiscal year 2021 budget.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Fritz. I'm going to share my screen with a presentation in terms of the status where we are with respect to our budget development for next fiscal year, or actually now the current fiscal year, which started July 1st. I guess the preface comment that I would make is, of course, since we are into a new fiscal year and have not yet had town meeting, that the state has allowed, and many municipalities, including Shrewsbury, have availed themselves of a so-called 1/12 budget, meaning taking 1/12 of the prior year budget as a minimum and rolling that forward. So we do have authorization to spend money this fiscal year, and are doing so simply to pay for those types of expenses for 12-month staff in our summer special education program that was referenced earlier for the month of July. And then the town will soon be seeking authorization for the month of August as well. And then we're hoping that during the month of August that the annual town meeting will be convened and then set our annual budget for the year. So with that preface, I just want to provide what I think is probably a relatively brief update and hit on various topics to include a couple of projection models about where we think we are relative to budget development for our expenses and what we believe to be the available revenue and resources from the town manager's recommendation, latest town manager's recommendation, and provide an update on some federal stimulus funds. Going to talk about an estimate, an ever-evolving estimate of projected COVID-related expenses that we would expect to be incurred this fiscal year. And then talk about the upcoming schedule. And then I'm really not going to get into this final topic, but really just providing, as part of this report, which will be posted on our website, as is all of the reports, for total transparency, a budget development chronology, because there are so many numbers and they keep changing. And so what I've provided is a chronology, if you will, of where our budget began back in January and then up through the present time with respect to reductions that the school committee has already voted, additional projected revenue for increased fees, and then the evolving town manager's projection along with COVID-related expenses. So that's an addendum I'm not really going to spend a lot of time on, but will be available to the community tomorrow morning. So,
Can I just interrupt you for one moment? Is
Sure.
it possible to play the slideshow version so that it might be a little bigger on people's screens? Thank you.
sure. Okay. So just in terms of where I think we're at with respect to our budget, I've presented two different models, if you will, because that's really what we're doing is we're modeling and estimating expenditures in terms of developing our budget. So model number one, and this is really kind of at a 50,000 foot level here, is the yellow bar represents what I'm terming the revised school department budget. And then adding in what I'm estimating at this point to be 2.25 million in COVID-related costs that cannot be funded from federal stimulus funds based upon either time or use restrictions. So another way to say that would be we started with a budget plan that Dr. Sawyer recommended to you back in January. And that was a budget plan of just over $70.5 million. And then knew at that subsequently that there would not be those types of resources available. So we developed some cut plans. Then we ran into COVID. And the school committee most recently voted a program and staff reduction plan of just over $1.9 million. So taking that into consideration, meaning that the original budget has been reduced by all of your voted reductions to include program and staff reductions previously presented, along with pay freezes for administrators and non-union staff. And then when you add into that 2.25 million in COVID-related expenses that are estimated, I'm coming up right now with $69.6 million is what would be needed for fiscal 21. That's the yellow bar. The town manager, once we hit COVID, has been re-estimating the total revenues he's projected to see for the town for all types of revenues that we receive, both state aid, local receipts, tax revenue, excise taxes, meals taxes, all of those things. And he asked all of the departments, including the school department, to come up with some range of reductions. And then he provided a range of estimated funding. And so for the school department, he gave us these two figures, which would be 66.1 million to 66.7 million. So when one looks at the difference between our revised budget and COVID-related expenses, yellow bar, and his low or bottom end and top end estimates for what he believes would be available for the school department, we come up with this gap of $3.5 million to $2.8 million still, even after all the reductions that you've already voted to enact. So that's model number one. Of course, implicit in this work is a whole series of assumptions. Number one, like I said, that only some of the COVID-related expenses get funded through federal stimulus funding. I'm going to go through those resources in more detail in a later slide. I've estimated that 2.25 million need to be incorporated into our locally appropriated town operating budget because many expenses would be continued to be incurred after December 30th, which is the deadline for much of the federal stimulus funding's availability. And implicit in this particular model is also that the town manager, in his estimates of what would be available, has projected a 6.5% decrease in state aid, Chapter 70 education aid, and that I've projected a 15 percentage point decrease in the special education circuit breaker reimbursement program. So those are some of the major assumptions. The caveats are situation continues to change. COVID costs are clearly estimates at this particular point. And also it is difficult to put together a financial plan or a financing plan for the delivery of educational services pre-K through 12 for next school year when we only have a so-called initial guidance document from the Department of Education about how we might return to school, and that there's lots of unknowns implicit in that. So those are some of the caveats. This next piece here is simply a demonstration to show the order of magnitude of our gap of 2.8 million to 3.5 million in model number 1. So theoretically, I just want to talk about in theoretical terms, this is not a recommended plan from the administration or Dr. Sawyer about how we would close this gap. That's not our plan with a capital N, but simply to demonstrate the order of magnitude if all of that gap were to be covered by the elimination of teaching positions at an average annual salary of $65,000, then we would need to eliminate between 44 to 54 full-time equivalent positions. Alternatively, if all of that gap needed to be assumed by the paraprofessional group, of which there's about 275 members working in those types of jobs, then we would need to eliminate 110 to 136 of those 270 positions. So, on the top end, about half of them. So that's just kind of an order of magnitude about the gap as we understand it for model number 1. Model number 2 is a bit more optimistic in that what this model tries to demonstrate is the same yellow bar where we are with our budget, 69.6 million. And then if this is my own takeoff on the town manager's work, this is not from the town manager, but if he were overly conservative about the state aid reduction and we actually got about $600,000 more than what he's projecting in state aid, and all of those monies were to come to the school department, then the gap gets closed by that amount of $600,000. So our gap gets reduced down to $2.2 to $2.9 million. So even if state aid gets better by $600,000, or about half of what he's estimating the reduction to be, we still have a major gap. That's what this model number 2 demonstrates. The same caveats are at play. The same major assumptions are at play. And of course, with a lower gap, it simply just lowers the equivalency of positions to be eliminated in that kind of theoretical sense. So those are the 2 models. The big picture is we still have a major problem and a major gap that we're facing for the upcoming school year. And in terms of federal stimulus funds that we've been reporting on, as information gets learned, they are helpful. Federal stimulus funds are certainly helpful, but the limitations of them are not solving our budget problem for fiscal 21, because the limitations on the use of those different federal funds are that they are time restricted, meaning that the funds are available now, but up to and only through costs incurred for December 30th of 2020. So if we have COVID-related costs that we incur on December 31st or thereafter, January, February, March, when we're running the school year still and the fiscal year, we need to absorb those costs in our operating budget. And that's why I factored in that 2.2 million in the yellow bar that I referenced earlier in those various models. The other problem is that they're use restricted. And I've said this a couple of times, and I'm going to repeat myself. This is not the federal stimulus check that you might have received, or the debit card that you might have received, or the direct deposit that you might have received from your federal tax return that says, here you go, here's your $1,200 or $2,400. You can go buy whatever you would like, go on vacation, buy a couch, pay off debt. That is not how these funds work for school department. You must incur the cost first. You must demonstrate and validate that it is due, that the cost was incurred as a result of the COVID virus, and then you submit for reimbursement. So these are not upfront monies that we get as a single check, and it's an open-ended kind of situation. So that's why the federal funds are helpful, but don't solve our budget problem for the upcoming school year. So what are those funds? There are now 3 different types of funds, and I've put the notification date in column 3 here because the situation is ever evolving, and people will have questions about, hey, when did you learn about this information? Why didn't you tell us this before? Or why didn't you know about this in May when you were talking about the budget? Well, the COVID Relief Fund, which we believe to be a allocation of about $1.4 million to the school department, is being allocated on a statewide basis at $225 per pupil. We learned about that from the commissioner and through the initial guidance on June 25th. So just about 2 weeks ago. To date, we learned about it then. It was referenced then. To date, they have still not published information about that grant on their website, nor confirmed the amount that we're going to receive, nor provided written publication like they do for all of their grants about specific authorization of use. But it's a good news story. We're happy to expect those funds in that range of about $1.4 million. And we know that those funds have a time limitation of December 30th. And those would be the first funds that we'll use. That's the priority of use in the far right column, number 1. Secondly is the CARES Act, so-called CARES Act. That's the $3.3 million bucket of money, if you will, that we learned about on June 23rd. And that is being distributed to all municipalities in the Commonwealth at $90 per capita. That's being administered by the Mass State Executive Office, Administration and Finance, and that's under the control of the Town Manager's Office. We have already accessed those funds back in June to procure, with the Town Manager's approval, additional iPads for K through 4 students and some of our remote technology software learning platforms. And he has asked now, having learned that we have this COVID Relief Fund directly from the Mass Department of Education, that we use those funds first before asking for additional allocations from the CARES Act Municipal Fund. So that's kind of a second priority of use, if you will, now. Thirdly is the so-called ESSER grant. That's the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. We learned about that in early June, and we reported that out to the school committee. We know that that's $133,000 to the school department. It's administered by the Department of Ed. That particular grant does have an extended use time period of June 30th, 2022. And so we think that the best strategy there is to hold off on using those funds and try to keep them in reserve for unexpected costs that may be incurred after December 30th this year, or potentially leverage those funds for use in fiscal 22. So that's the third and last priority of use of the federal stimulus funding buckets of funds. I kind of went through these pieces already in the prior slide. Again, that we've already accessed some funding from the CARES Act. We don't yet have an application or any monies from the COVID Relief Fund, but we can expect that. And we're recommending that we hold off on use of the ESSER grant till a future date. So in terms of COVID-related expenses, this might be hard to read for some folks, I understand, but my goal here was to put on one page and provide, again, kind of in the total transparency of thinking, what types of expenses are we going to incur? And some of these are direct COVID related, and some of these are frankly still just major changes in our budget that were incurred along the way. But first and foremost, the circuit breaker decrease. I'm not going to go through all of these because it would take far too much time, and I've provided kind of a similar list before. This is simply updated. But the circuit breaker decrease of $465,000 is what I referenced earlier. That funding is funding that we typically receive on an annual basis. It's reimbursement for high-cost special needs students, typically in out-of-district placements, but also in-district students. And in other financial crises that we've experienced as a state and as a nation, that reimbursement program has been decreased. So I projected a 15 percentage point decrease, and on a base of about $3 million that we receive annually. If we had a 15% decrease, then we're going to lose $465,000 of revenue that I was planning on originally in our budget plan. That's not, I don't think, but still yet to be determined, I don't think that that would be covered by any kind of federal stimulus funding. So we need to budget for that in our operating budget. And that's why I have these various columns here, in yellow, that we need to incorporate some of these costs into our operating budget. And then we can allocate others into this federal stimulus funding, whether it's the CARES funding from the town or the COVID relief fund or the ESSER grant. So the next example, and maybe I'll just end with that one, is additional LTS and sick time, additional long-term substitute teachers and sick time. This is an estimate saying basically that when we return to school in full, in person, come this fall, if that is the guidance and plan and directive, and the virus allows us to do that, that I'm estimating that 5% of our 500-member teaching staff will not be able to come back to work because of their own medical situation, being immune compromised, or maybe a family member. So we need to find replacements for those 5%. 5% to 500 is 25 people. Our typical rate for a long-term substitute teacher is $250 per school day. With 180 school day year, 25 people at $250 a day for 180 school days is over $1.1 million. Now we know that we can use some federal stimulus monies, whether it's the CARES fund or the COVID relief fund, to the tune of $500, which would be 80 of the 180 school days up through December 30th. But then we need to account for and provide resources in our operating budget for the remaining 100 days between January, whatever, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, whenever we return, to the end of June. That's the $625,000. So what I'm doing here in the cost estimate is providing the total cost. And then to the right of the gray shaded column is saying, here's how we might allocate these expenses out. And this is, again, a moving target, ever evolving. Other simpler things, and I will do just one more example. If you move down to the middle of the page where it says COVID supplies, like masks, shields, dividers, $100,000, that's kind of a best estimate. That's really simple because that's a concrete, tangible, one-time expense, and can certainly fit under the umbrella of using federal stimulus funds. And so we would allocate that out, and federal stimulus funding will help us with that. But if you look kind of at the far bottom of this page, the last row, the preliminary estimate, I'm now at a total COVID-related cost estimate of $4.4 million. That is a complete double from what I estimated and reported to you in May. In May, while I was just initially developing this preliminary list, it was at $2.2 million. This is an ever-evolving cost estimate. I'm happy to receive input from any of the school committee members and the community members and of our faculty, anybody who has any idea about what kind of costs we're going to incur with the information that we have at hand, and we'll continue to adjust this cost estimate list. By no means do I have the answers to how we're going to operate and what it's going to cost. That's what makes this ever evolving. But that 4.4 million, I believe, generally, if you were to look at the trend from May to June being a double, and we still have still are absent many of the key informational metrics about how we're going to operate next year, I would think that cost estimate is going to go up as opposed to down. To what degree, to what variance, I couldn't tell you. But my general guess, if I were a betting man, is that cost estimate's going to go up. And therefore, the models that I showed you in number 1 and number 2, those gaps would likely increase by that same amount. So the total appropriation, when you allocate the 4.4 million out, I'm thinking that 2.25 million needs to come from the general fund operating budget. And that's why I added into those models, and that the remainder of the cost could be allocated out to these various federal stimulus fund grant programs. So that's what this particular page is meant to show and demonstrate, and give the school committee kind of an up-to-date, up-to-the-minute cost estimate about where we're at. In terms of our budget schedule going forward, there are some things that are very predictable, which is great. Certainty is a very good thing these days. And so what we do know is that the tentative annual town meeting date, which seems to be getting firmer as each day passes, would be on August 8th, which is a Saturday, and being planned for, I believe, to be almost like an all-day event, probably with a break in the middle of it. I know other communities have a similar model already pre-COVID, like the town of Westboro. They typically do a Saturday annual town meeting and have a lunch break. So I think that's what's being planned now. But with an August 8th annual town meeting date, that necessarily means that all of the town meeting warrant information and associated supplementary materials are planned for mailing on July 28th. And we just learned about that date today. So I included that into your presentation. You didn't have that originally in your school committee meeting materials that we sent yesterday, because we learned about that today. So between now and July 22nd is when we need to finalize our bottom line in terms of the school department budget recommendation. And finally, I think that this year, of course, would be different, and that we'll have to adapt how we develop a budget, meaning that typically we have a very high level of specificity and definition down to the 0.1 FTE of our staffing plan, and all of those things really wrapped up and prepared typically on an annual budget cycle. And I'm thinking that that may not be the case this year, that we're going to likely have to move ahead with some uncertainty even leading up to town meeting, and continue to make budget-related decisions after August 8th with the information that we have a bottom line fixed budget, and then need to kind of fit into that, if you will, in a kind of a backwards way. So that's kind of our timeline. The last 2 slides, as I said before, I'm not going to go through because there's just way too many numbers and dates. This is really just a reference document. This is an appendix, and this is a chronology of our evolution of our budget process. And I just wanted to make sure that people knew that that was there. So that's what I have for the committee, and I can stop sharing my screen if you wish, Mrs. Fritz.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Collins. And before we even get on to comments and questions, I just want to thank you for all the work you've been doing for weeks and weeks. This is I've never seen anything like this. I don't know if you have, but it's very complex, and the targets do keep moving, and you've always done great work, but you're really going above and beyond. So I just want to give, thank you for that, because I know it's been a lot of work.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Any comments or questions from the committee? Dale.
So yes, I'd like to compliment you on your work as well. And I think the hard part about this is you finish the job, and then somebody changes a rule someplace or whatever, and you're back at the bottom of the mountain. But I have a couple of observations. One is that not all of the available relief funds were being used in your model. There seemed to be a little over $1 million or something approaching $1.5 million that still could be available. Is there a way of working that in so that we can decrease the ask to the town budget?
That's certainly a possibility. I think, again, we're seeking and awaiting information from the Mass Department of Education relative to that $1.4 million in the COVID relief, so-called COVID relief fund. Certainly, in terms of the priority of use is we would certainly leverage federal stimulus dollars first where possible. I guess the rhetorical question is it possible that we are unable to expend the full amount that might be made available to us prior to December 30th because of the use restriction or the time restriction? That's a possibility. That's an unfortunate possibility. And we're trying to do what we can in terms of lobbying or advocating for an extension of that December 30th date, because that would really unhinge that restriction and provide a lot more relief for us.
Sure, go ahead, Dale.
So related to this is that when we ask for additional funds from the town meeting budget, it seems to me we've already been told by the town they don't have enough money to give us to begin with. And so the translation of that is really, excuse me, those are cuts. Those are we're looking at our potential cuts. When we say we're shifting something to the town meeting budget to the tune of, $1+ million, then what that really means is that we're expecting to essentially turn those things into cuts.
That's right.
Correct with that?
Yes.
And I guess the last thing is, with the volatility of everything going on, do we know how we can operationalize the ability to revisit the budget repeatedly as the year goes on, so that we can try to, people can see what's really happening? I think we're in sort of the land of speculation right now, and it's impairing people's ability to negotiate or make decisions. And it seems that after a period of time, it may be valuable for us to allow the community and the department to see what's actually happened.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the structure, of course, that's in place is that the authority to appropriate or set budgets is rests with the annual town meeting, which typically is a one-time event. And so it really does, the situation as you just described, it really begs the question about should there be some sort of mid-year revisitation of this, and at that point reassess where revenues are actually landing, and frankly they could be better or they could be worse, and then potentially revisit the annual appropriations for not only the school department, but all municipal departments as well. So that's a point well taken, but that's really, I think, of course, probably the discussion is best had with, the Board of Selectmen and the Finance Committee, and see if that might be a strategy that we can adapt to given the circumstances.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dale. Lindsay.
Yeah, of course, want to echo my thanks as well. The amount of work is incredible, and what you're operating under. It was untenable, certainly. I'm wondering a little bit about, we keep hoping for those things that we can feel a little more firm on. And we know that the state has asked us to come up as a district with 3 different plans, and those plans themselves have costs attached to them. The deadline, this could be for either you or Dr. Sawyer, the deadline for those plans, and then when do we think we might hear back, right? If maybe they say, we don't like your plan and we want you to go buy more tables, or we want you to do something else. Do we know anything about what that timeline looks like?
You're on mute, there you go.
Yes, thank you. Just unmuting. So I think, in terms of we have not been given a specific deadline yet. We've been told sometime in early August. It is not my belief that the department is going to have the bandwidth to look at 350 or 70 some odd districts' plans and say yes to this or no to that. I think the exercise is really more about indicating what's possible under each of those 3 scenarios and how you would do those things. I think that the commissioner has alluded to, certainly and publicly has been stating that the preferred model is to get back in person. And then if a district indicated that its preferred model was not to go back in person, the department will want to understand why that is. If is that based on, and part of what they're trying to do also is get some information to help lobby the legislature for funding for schools because of these different costs that will be associated with this. So the problem is, of course, that we're in this very small window of time that we're going to have to make some decisions. And the next conversation we're going to have in the next agenda item is about transportation, and we're awaiting state guidance on transportation. We may come to a point where we have to make some decisions on transportation absent the state guidance and then adjust. I think the same thing is going to go for some of this work to prepare for the school year. We are going to be furiously planning over the next couple of weeks. I think that we're going to have to make wherever we can make decisions that we feel at least we can put into place for the start of the school year, we're going to need to do that, and then spend time executing to those. There's going to be some areas where there's going to be some gray. We're not going to know exactly how we might handle certain things, but we're going to have some contingencies. So it really is, we're flying with our instruments. It's not visual flight rules for sure right now, and and those aren't necessarily. There's a lot of variables we just don't know yet. So it is frustrating. We know everybody's doing the best they can, whether that's at the State Department level or Department of Public Health level and whatnot. And there's obviously in the news today, there's a lot of information because there's now a federal push from the Office of the President of the United States to get kids back to school and threatening to withhold funding. And the CDC is now saying they're going to revise their guidelines somehow. Again, so we have more moving targets, perhaps. So I think we have to continue to focus on the things that we do know, make the best plans we can, and we will be communicating in the very near future with families relative to their sense of whether, if we have in-person school, we have some families who may be reluctant to send their child. We need to know who they are. We also need to know if people are going to be reluctant to use the bus. That's the conversation we'll have next. And so it is really, it's a very intricate, complex planning process right now. I'm confident we will do the best we can under the circumstances, but it is going to be imperfect.
Go ahead, Lindsay.
And just to follow up on that, I think it's important for those watching at home, if they didn't catch all of your caveats, Mr. Collins, that almost every line on that Excel spreadsheet we were going through is an unfirm number, is a best estimate, whether it's number of desks that we're going to need to number of, how many teachers are going to have to, how many long-term subs are we going to need, or how low is the state maybe going to or not going to cut certain parts of our funding. And so, I want to almost put the big word like draft on the back to make it clear that every single line item that we're looking at right now is sort of fungible to one degree or another, and can swing in both directions, right? With costs can go up, and then certainly in some of these places we might be either overestimating or guidelines could change. So it certainly does make it awfully difficult for us to figure it out. The question about how can we have a mid-year course correction is not a bad one for us as a community to really think through, because we are in such a place of uncertainty. So thank you for all of your work. I appreciate the help.
Yes, you're welcome.
Jason.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Collins, for your work on this presentation. And I just want to underscore to the community, especially those watching at home, the gravity of this situation. We are no strangers here in Shrewsbury to financial difficulties facing our public school district. It's a conversation we've been having for years. Our town's revenue stream is constricted. Our expenses go up and up and up, and that's largely because our costs are largely built in. So I know that for folks on the outside looking in, it can be difficult to fully understand the gravity of the situation. But it's different in two key, very oversimplified ways. First of all, the level of volatility here is astounding. We usually are able to predict how terrible things are going to be for us. And now it's the terrible plus a complete lack of ability to see much past the next few months for a variety of factors having to do with the pandemic, to what the Commonwealth is able to do, to what the federal government is going to get its act together to do. This level of volatility this late in the game is unprecedented. But then on the other side, for a multitude of reasons, including addressing the educational challenges around the pandemic, including the very important and urgent need to get serious and do very important work on race and equity. The needs from this district have never been so pronounced and so acute. This is, to be in a tough budget situation, not a new place for Shrewsbury, but I just want to underscore that this is a very, very new place for us to be in. The expectation and the need for Shrewsbury Public Schools to be performing at peak cannot be overstated. And this at the same time where we are in a deep budget hole, just compounded by an absolute lack of ability to predict just a few weeks and months down the road. So I just want to underscore to the community, this is unlike places we've been in recent years for reasons that go, frankly, even far above and beyond COVID. This is a deeply disturbing situation, and I appreciate the leadership of our central office team in particular for doing their absolute best to do as much planning as possible. But this is not a place we have been before as a community.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jason. John?
Yeah, not much more to add to what everybody said. And again, thank you, Patrick, for helping us navigate through all this uncharted territory. If we thought the normal budget cycle was, hard enough to navigate through, we're now on a different planet in terms of your best guesstimates. And I say guesstimates, and I would advocate patience for everybody watching because all of those guesstimates have likely changed already, right? So between the time-based and the use-based funding that we can use, what we might or might not receive down the road, we don't know. This is all based on what we know today. But I also think at the end of the day, whatever the fall looks like, it's certainly the safety of the students and the educators that are paramount, right? So, and I do have other questions related to transportation. I know we're going to get to that topic in a moment, but thank you for all the work that you're doing to keep us up to date on this very fluid situation.
All right, you're welcome.
I think it's this complex, unknown situation, and Jason said it, best. This is something we have not dealt with in this magnitude, with these types of expectations and uncertainties and changes. We're going to do everything we can to mitigate that gap. We're including, ongoing discussions with all school union groups. Dr. Sawyer, Mr. Collins, Dr. McGee, and myself have been meeting regularly with Town Manager Kevin Mizikar and Board of Selectmen John Samia and Mo DiPaolo to make sure that we're all talking and communicating about what's going on around the financial picture in the district and the municipal side of the house as well. So we're going to keep moving forward, do the best we can, but it is a short time between now and town meeting, and there's a lot of work to be done, and hopefully we'll have some more, but work on those levers that we know, some more information, so we have a better idea of what this budget's going to look like for next year. So thank you again, Mr. Collins, for all the work you've been doing. We're going to stay with Mr. Collins. We're going to move into transportation discussion. Mr. Collins will present information regarding issues related to transportation logistics for this upcoming school year. And we will talk about some possibilities for adapting the fee structure in response to these unprecedented conditions. So turn it back to Mr. Collins.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Fritz. I just need a second to switch presentations and share my screen. Okay, can folks see that first slide now? Okay, thank you. So again, it's just some considerations, no request or expectation around decision-making tonight, but rather, given the urgency of time in making decisions and communicating with parents, we do plan to, I plan to make a recommendation to you next week at your meeting for a decision about transportation services for the upcoming year, and it will likely be different than the way we've done things in the past. So first, I just want to let you know that some of the topics that I think are important right now tonight are just giving you an update with respect to the guidance from Department of Ed, some talk about potential ideas around school start and end times, the timing of the policy and protocol decisions at the state and local level, looking at our service level and state minimum requirements, ridership forecasting, the financial impact, and cleaning protocols for buses. So first is, again, the pertinent and information that we have from the Department of Education is the latest information we have is June 25th. And at that time, in their initial return to school guidance with respect to transportation, they mentioned that they intend to issue further guidance sometime in the future. So that was on June 25th. And that future information will cover these various topics to include transportation. We're not really sure what that means, if it's going to be guidance. And, you know, by definition, guidance is guidance, meaning, you know, we think this is good guidance, but we're, you know, delegating or still allowing local control. And you can follow the guidance or not follow the guidance or be close to the guidance. So that's, you know, for me, part of the dilemma here is the conflation of what is guidance and then what is also a rule or a regulation. And what we're seeing so far is those two things being used interchangeably in some of the publications from the Department of Education. And I know that they're doing the best that they can. I'm not trying to criticize that, but just necessarily make the distinction that, for example, we know that there's going to be a regulation on return to school, regulation of a minimum of 3-foot distancing. That's what we understand to be a rule. And guidance that they might provide around transportation might simply be that. It might be guidance as opposed to rules, a fixed set of rules that is a recipe or prescription about exactly how we're going to do things. So even when we get information, it might not answer a lot of the questions that we all have or be at a level of specificity that we might all want. So just the other consideration, certainly we can expect that if we return to school, if the assumption is we're returning to school in full, that many parents will opt to drive their students as opposed to have them take the bus like they did before. And we can also expect that many parents won't have that option and will need to put their child on the bus like they've done before. And that the simple act of debarking or getting off the bus and maintaining physical distancing is going to take a lot longer than the normal debarkation process, where kids rush off and they're all kind of scrunched up, you know, front to back and get off, you know, relatively quickly. And then the bus leaves to go its next tier or whatever it might be. So we can also expect a lot more parent traffic at both arrival and dismissal time. And we need to plan for that, that it's going to take a lot longer, just like having any kind of even, you know, meetings that we're having, you know, whether they're Zoom meetings or what have you, things just take a lot longer in this environment. And transportation and arrival and dismissal will take a lot longer. So we need to plan for that. We also need to plan for, if we want to, we would expect to have students maintain 3-foot physical distancing. They can't all get off the bus and then just go to the lockers adjacent to one another, which are literally adjacent to one another, inches apart. They need to maintain physical distancing. That we're going to have to adapt our intake procedures, if you will, for students, whether they're dropped off by a bus, parents walk, take a bike, and allow for more time in the morning to maintain that physical distancing and have maybe a system where students are going to a classroom and then a few at a time go to their locker, arrange their personal belongings, their backpacks, their lunches, and things like that. So it's going to take a lot longer at the beginning of the day and a lot longer at the end of the day. So one consideration might be either A, that we change our official school start and end times, or alternatively B, we keep those in place for consistency of parents and whatnot, but that within the time frame of the day that we adapt our schedule so that we have a much longer homeroom period at the beginning and the end of the day, if you will, and less educational time while students are in session, because we're using some of that time for just getting them in and out of school. So that's just another consideration. With respect to, local, state and local decision making, again, we don't, as of right now, have anything written or definitive. We typically would have opened up bus registration on April 1st, like we do every year, and then closed it on June 30th, and then have about 6 weeks to make bus routes, and then communicate with parents about bus numbers, bus stops, bus pickup and drop off times. None of that has been done. And hasn't been done because we're not sure if there are going to be limitations about how many students can be on a bus. And so we didn't want to set up a false pretense, if you will, and have people register thinking that they're on the bus and then subsequently have to tell them, sorry, you're not on the bus, or have to make decisions about who gets to ride or who doesn't get to ride. So no registrations have occurred thus far. I think the realistic situation is that the decisions that we're likely to get from the state won't come in a time frame that meets our needs. And that, as Dr. Sawyer mentioned earlier, we're going to have to just take the initiative to make some local decisions, and then maybe, if we have to, change them or adapt them later when we get more definitive guidance from the state. But what we do know as a factual piece is that the final written guidance that we received for operating summer special education school, we received from the department last Friday, and we opened up summer special education school on Monday. We can't have that happen with respect to transportation. That system just doesn't work. So we need to make some decisions sooner rather than later. So what I'm suggesting is that if ridership limits are implemented, we have to reconsider likely our service level. Our service level right now, in simple terms, is whoever wants to ride a bus signs up to ride a bus, and they register in the springtime, and then based upon their grade level and their distance from school, they're either charged a fee or they're free, and that's based upon the state law. The state law, again, in summary, says that we are required to, at a minimum, provide free transportation to students who are in kindergarten through grade 6 who live 2 or more miles from their school. That's what we're required to do. Anything beyond that, we are not required to do. But we do it to two purposes. One is to provide a better service level to our parent community, many of people who are working and rely on transportation. And secondly, to not cause major traffic problems at all of our schools. So that's really kind of the premise behind it. And of course, we charge a fee to those students and families who aren't eligible for free transportation. So that's our system. We may need to cut back on that and provide a lesser service level if we have capacity limitations, and then repurpose those buses for other students. So that might be one possibility. In terms of looking at that, I just looked at the last year data in terms of ridership and how many students from each school were under 2 miles and how many were over 2 miles. And you can see basically it's almost about 1/3 and 2/3. So about 1/3 of the students who registered and paid the 1,422, that's about 1/3 of our ridership under 2 miles. And then 2 or more miles is about 2/3. And again, we're not required to provide transportations to students at Sherwood, Oak, or the high school because of their, for Oak or the high school because of their grade level. But we do it as a service and charge a fee for that. One possibility might be that we cut back on our service level and, excuse me, have a registration system that says basically, we're going to open up bus registration, but we're only going to open it up for example, K through 12 students who live 2 or more miles from school. And if we were to do that, then I know that right off the top, we would cut out a third of our ridership. And in terms of bus capacity, we'd likely be able to meet the capacity restrictions because we know that a third of students won't be riding. And on top of that, some parents are going to opt to drive their kids anyway. So I would estimate if this kind of metric were put in place that our ridership would be down, probably by at least 40%. And so we could probably fit, if they cap ridership at, 25 or 35 students, we could probably make all of that work with our existing buses. So that might be one model that we look at and that I might recommend next week is we change our business rules, if you will, and then open up registration. In talking with our technology folks who are absolute wizards, they tell me that they could reprogram the registration pages to have that kind of criteria so that if you were a parent, for example, and of course, not everybody's tuned into what's going on up to the minute. So if we said, hey, bus registration's open, and you, like I do, I live right near Patton School, and I tried to register my kids, that the system would say, sorry, Pat Collins, you can't register your kids. You live too close to school. You're going to have to find alternative means. But if you were assigned to Patton School and you lived 3 miles away, then the system would allow you to register and you'd be all set to go. So that might be one model. What really kind of is a requisite, I think, for this situation, if we do restrict service levels, and also try to avoid at all costs, which I'm recommending, getting into a system of accepting payment and then subsequently have to do refunds, or, if we're going to have a situation of individual school closures because of a virus outbreak or a district-wide closure for some period of time, we have to avoid this refund situation. It is just an enormous time-consuming task, and we really just don't have the inherent staff to keep managing that. So that's why I'm thinking that maybe a recommendation might be we open up registration and have parents commit to, if they were to be, if they had to pay for it, meaning they'd be in the upper grades, that they would have to sign or check off a box saying that they agree to pay, and that would collect payment maybe in December. At that time, we'd have a better sense in terms of what our school closures were or were not. So that might be another model, instead of the upfront payment, that we let them ride with the understanding that if they are due a fee to be paid, that they pay it later. So I think I kind of covered these pieces here, that the upfront fee makes this much more complicated in our situation where we charge fees. And I am certainly strongly recommending that we avoid that situation upfront, given the uncertainty about where we're going to be in terms of school opening, remote or hybrid model. So what would that mean? Well, the bus fee revenue budgeted for next fiscal year is $750,000. So this is not a light decision to make. But I think there's a balance point here too around how do we potentially limit ridership, but also encourage people to take a bus so that we don't have everybody driving. And so that would mean postponing the collection of the fee, I think, might entice more parents to say, you know what, if I don't have to pay up front, then I might be more likely to register if I live more than 2 miles, for example, from school. So I will make a recommendation next week to you. I know there's a lot of moving parts to this. I completely understand that there's not a lot of time for you to discern, in full scope, all the merits and limitations of various models. But that's kind of where we are. In terms of cleaning protocols, I have been in contact with the owner of AA Transportation. He has procured cleaning supplies, which is basically a similar type system that our town has purchased through custodial services, which is almost like a water gun system, if you will, an aerosol water gun system with a disinfectant that is used in private sector, healthcare, education settings. And so he's fully prepared to have his drivers sanitize buses on some reasonable schedule, meaning probably, once a day or once a week, absent any kind of regulation from the state. Certainly time would not allow for cleaning in between runs. Our schedules are just too tight, and that type of system, no matter what kind of disinfectant you typically use on those spraying systems, it requires at least an 8 to 10 minute set time. So that would not be possible on in between high school and middle school and elementary runs, but potentially daily or weekly kind of cleaning system is what he's prepared to do. And if there's something more or much more elaborate than that, then we may need to renegotiate some terms of the contract because none of that was intentioned when we set this contract about 2-3 years ago. So next steps, we'll continue to wait guidance, but I do think I need to make a recommendation to you next week so that we could open up bus registration at the end of next week so that we could get data and that we could begin planning for bus routes. And it might also be a situation where if we were to open up and restrict ridership to those students who live only 2 miles or more, and we see that registrations are, low, and maybe the guidance from the state says we don't need to cap things, then maybe we could adjust that mileage down to 1.5 miles or something like that, and reopen registration, at a later point. Because I do understand it's going to be a hardship for some families. And I also think that, what this type of new business rule would mean, as an example, if you can envision where Oak Middle School sits at the top of the hill on Oak Street, and that down the hill across Route 9 on the south side of Route 9 is Yorkshire Apartments, where we have a lot of students living. Those students would not be eligible for transportation to Sherwood and Oak Middle School. So, as a policy matter, do we want to consider some exceptions to that 2 mile rule for, say, large apartment complexes where there just simply might be, more or less ability for some families to coordinate their own transportation or provide their own transportation. So that's a question. The places that we can think about that might make sense are that type of situation. Maybe Shrewsbury Green for Coolidge School. Maybe there's other areas that some exceptions are made so that we could transport those students and provide for those families. So I know that's a lot of information, and it's a little bit, I'm trying to raise issues, if you will, so that the committee can have some things to consider and certainly ask questions now or later, and certainly provide any guidance that you might have for me at this time.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Collins. If you could stop sharing your screen. There we go. Any questions or comments? Dale.
If I can distill this down, chances are the bus company doesn't have buses laying around unused, and they're not going to be in a position to buy no more buses. So we're probably restricted in the number of buses available to what we've got already. And it's also probably fair to say that our costs are by the bus. It's not by how many people are on the bus. So our costs are going to be about what we budgeted for already. And then the third thing is that if I look at the students who are under 7th grade further than 2 miles away, that's roughly, I think, about a third or so, maybe a third to a half. So if we were to employ, if the rule comes down that your capacity is down to a third or maybe a little more than that, that may be consumed by the people who we are obligated to provide transportation at no charge to. And the only space we would have to realize any revenues would be in those cases where somebody who lived further than 2 miles chose not to take the bus and opened up a slot for a paying customer. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think the only point that I would make is that, you know, on the greater than 2 miles, if you mean that if they're in grades 7 through 12, then yes, we could open up and they would pay a fee. Absolutely. You know, K through 6, if they're over 2 miles, we can't charge a fee.
No, I'm sorry. I meant under 2 miles. So basically, we're obligated to the K through 6 over 2 miles, and that
Correct.
may well consume all our capacity. And the only time capacity is freed up is in so much as those individuals opt not to take the bus, in which case it opens it up to the people who otherwise would be paying customers. But no matter how we look at it, we're looking at what is likely to be a very substantial decrease in our busing fees.
Yes.
And that is going to be added to the gap that we were looking at in your previous presentation.
I did make an estimate as part of the COVID-related expenses that we would lose 75% of our free revenue.
Okay, great.
It would not be added on top of that, but it is, you know, the 75% amounts to $562,000. So,
okay. So that was in already. Great.
What I'll share is, again, because it's just information out there, that the state of Connecticut Department of Education did release their initial school reopening guidance. And it's not to say that Massachusetts is going to do the same, but just as a reference point, they are placing no ridership restrictions on yellow school busing, but rather simply requiring all students to wear a mask. And so they have that in place, given the current status of the virus in that state. So it might change, but you know, if that were the case for us, that would certainly give us more room to transport students. And again, that might speak to a strategy where we kind of iterate this thing and take a progressive approach, absent state information. So a lot of moving parts.
I don't remember the statistics exactly, but after the onset of COVID and before the schools were shut down, there was a little gap of time when we were doing business as usual. And I don't recall that there were any cases of COVID among those under 20 in this state. So there may be a little gap there where we have some data that may inform the equation a little bit.
Yeah, and we still, I think the latest information that I understand for the town of Shrewsbury is that we have 318 cases, and I think it's approximately 3% of them were related to people that were aged 0 to 19. Mm-hmm. So it is a very small percentage. That's information that's shared by the state publicly. And so, there's been very few confirmed cases in Shrewsbury for our student population group thus far.
And the state does not share with us the severity of illness at all, I don't believe. So we don't, they could be completely, minor illness or less, or it could be severe. We just don't know.
Right.
Anyone else have any questions or comments? Lindsay? You're on mute.
Thanks, everybody. Sorry. I come at this from a couple different perspectives. Certainly, as a parent with 3 kids, all of whom have taken the bus, I have, given some of the ways the thinking is going here, I have one who would be potentially aged out, one who would just make the 2.2 miles to take the bus, and a second grader who was in a 1.9 miles away from her school. So as a parent, causes great anxiety and uncertainty about where do my kids go 7 weeks from now. And so I want to just acknowledge to our parent community that as we try to figure this out, we are certainly thinking about them and what the impacts for families and transportation are hugely important. And we know that. I'm usually right about now, right? We're getting ready. A few weeks from now, we would be figuring out what the bus pickup time was and then scheduling the whole families around those. So this is important to our community. But I'm also deeply troubled and concerned that we think about this through an equity lens. When I looked at our different elementary schools and the percentage of kids based on things that children have no control over, of housing density and where we place schools and where we have drawn lines for who goes to what school. You have a school like Coolidge where only 13% of the kids are at over 2 miles. And then you have a school like Beale that's drawing from the entire community, right? And again, lots of kids don't have any choice about where we've decided to make some of those, so that we'd be really thoughtful here about the impacts that we're going to have on families. And I don't know what that means, Patrick, in terms of what I think makes sense yet, but it causes me great concern. And just the number of kids alone that take the bus to the high school, it's a huge number, and we know our high school is uniquely situated, let's say, in our town. If we're going to suddenly push a whole bunch of high schoolers onto the road and driving, and we all know some of the concerns we have about our young people driving as much as they love it. Now we have more kids driving and getting to high school. So this is certainly fraught. And if I did my math right, and I definitely, there was quick math based on what you had up on the screen, and we only serviced the young people that we are absolutely required to service. So those K through 6 over 2 miles, we're at about 29% of what our total ridership is as of this year. And so that's even a greater reduction than what we're thinking we might, that I live in a little bit of a world of transportation. That's a pretty severe reduction in terms of spacing. So there is wiggle room in here. And we also know, from talking to other parents, I know many of them are saying, I'm not going to put my kid on the bus. And so our baseline projections don't even make sense anymore of a way to compare. So people are going to be making all sorts of different choices. I think we're going to have to take some sort of incremental approach, like you're saying, because we just don't know how many people are going to be interested. And it might be something along the lines of gauging interest and then saying you've been allotted a spot, right? Or something that does feel very different from our normal protocols, but to get a sense of just what the appetite is in our community, to put kids and the younger the kids are and their inability to wear masks. My sister-in-law sent me a photo the other day of her 3 kids who were 10, 8, and 4. And the 4-year-old had the mask on over his eyeballs, and the other 2 had it on his face. She said, "This is what masks are for young people, right?" That's another important distinction. If we're busing children who won't and aren't required to wear masks, should that be part of our calculus? So thank you for raising all of it up. And it's sort of, I feel like we just threw a whole bunch of chips in the air. I'm not sure where they should fall, but thank you for all the complexity.
And I do think, just as a point of clarification, one thing that, one model would be you just bus to state minimums. And as you said, our ridership would be way low and probably lower than even if needed, even if some capacity restrictions were put in. Another model that I should have been more clear about is probably a better approach, and maybe one that we pursue or think about more definitively, is busing beyond the state minimum, but taking that group from that slide that you have that says 2 or more miles. So busing all students K through 12 who live 2 or more miles. Now, that would be beyond the state regulation. But if we were to do that, we know that that cuts out about 1/3 of our ridership and has 2/3 riding. And we know that 2/3 who might be eligible to ride and sign up like they did last year probably won't because of COVID. So that it would be less than 2/3 and we'd be likely to meet some sort of capacity restriction and not cut out busing for Oak Middle School and not cut out busing for the high school and still run a system with our existing buses. So that might be a model that we, think about a little bit more going forward. And then again, this idea of iterating on this so that if that were our initial approach, and then, this can go a couple different ways. If the state were to say, look, we're not going to put any specific number capacity limitation on buses. They just all have to wear a mask. Like if they were to do like that Connecticut, then maybe we could reopen more. We could reopen more seats beyond, under 2 miles, and be that kind of like a second round of bus registration. So that's the problem with working in an environment where we don't have any guidance, we don't have any rules, and we're reticent to just open it all up and then find out that there are restrictions and then have to go back on and try to communicate with hundreds or thousands of parents saying, I know you signed up, but you can't have a ride anymore. And certainly we wouldn't want to be in that situation. And that's what we need to avoid. And that's why we've not opened up bus registration to this particular point.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Anyone else? Not saying anything. I think, again, this is another complex issue we have to deal with, and we have a lot of unknowns, guidance, rules. We're not getting, what we really need, but people, I should say, parents are concerned. I mean, you're starting to see some of the chatter on Facebook about transportation because they need to know what is going to happen for their kids. And so we have to really be mindful about what we do and how we do it. But again, there's a lot of unknowns with this one as well. But having some plan next week for a vote will at least get some certainty for families and for us as well with the budgeting. I do have a question on the contractor, if they're seeing increased costs for cleaning supplies that we may have to renegotiate the contract. There's no way for them to get something under some type of COVID relief for the business to cover those additional costs, or is it something that just passes through to us?
No, I think if it's kind of more, right now in my discussions, it would be if the supplies are he's absorbing that. He has received some federal stimulus funding for one of the programs for so-called small businesses. I guess, his concern is going to be if there's something very elaborate around cleaning protocols that require lots of labor.
Okay.
The supplies are, kind of relatively cheap. It's really the labor cost. And so if it's something that can be dispensed through, kind of the squirt gun, lack of a better term, it's an aerosol kind of gun and done fairly efficiently by his drivers, then I think we're fine. And I don't think there will be any additional cost. If it's something that, requires lots of labor, then I think that could be more problematic for us.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Dr. Sawyer, any comments or questions?
I want to thank Mr. Collins for his work on this and his thinking about how we might address, what again is a very complex issue. I'm hopeful that we'll get some guidance from the state before our meeting next Wednesday. If not, I do think we have to take an initial step at least, and I think maybe doing this in an iterative way may make sense. I am also appreciate the feedback from the committee. Particularly, obviously, one of our core values as a school district is equity. We need to make sure that we are being thoughtful about how decisions we make might play out differently for different students in different schools, different neighborhoods, and so forth. There's obviously, just as the unknowns are relative to a safety and health issue relative to COVID, We also have to consider, of course, the safety of students relative to walking to school. There's all those pieces that have to be thought about when we think about what kind of plan we will be able to put forward. But again, I thank Mr. Collins and his team and the work that they're doing on this, and we will bring back something concrete for you to react to and hopefully take a vote on a week from tonight.
Great, thank you again. Okay, next we have our minutes from the school committee meetings held on June 24th, 2020 and July 6th, 2020. Are there any changes or corrections? I'm not seeing any, so those can be marked as approved as distributed. We do need to go into executive session tonight for the purpose of addressing Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A7, to comply with or act under the authority of any general or special law or federal grant and aid requirements. Purpose 7, Open Meeting Law, Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 22FG, for the purpose of reviewing, approving, and or releasing executive session minutes. And B, for the purpose of addressing Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A3, to discuss strategy with respect to collective bargaining or litigation if an open meeting may have a detrimental effect on the bargaining or litigating position of the public body. And the chair so declares. Purpose 3, the Shrewsbury Education Association Unit A, Shrewsbury Education Association Unit B, the Shrewsbury Paraprofessional Association, and or the Shrewsbury Cafeteria Workers, where deliberation in an open meeting may have a detrimental effect on the bargaining position of the public body, and return to open session only for the purpose of adjourning for the evening. May I have a motion that we adjourn to executive session?
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. A roll call vote is required. Dale?
Aye.
Jason?
Aye.
Lindsay?
Aye.
John?
Aye.
Myself, aye. Thank you and good night.